Thanks for joining us, and I'm very excited. Today we have Lily Slavin. She has been working with Tim Hartshorn, is working on her PhD as a doctoral candidate, and has done some phenomenal work on the educational checklist for charge. So hopefully some of you have seen that work, but we're going to hear more from Lily today, and excited to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you for your introduction. I am so excited to be presenting today. I just love every opportunity that I have to be able to talk directly with parents and professionals about the work that I've been doing. I think that this checklist can be really beneficial to a lot of students with charge, so I really want to get the word out as much as we can. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. I'm so excited to be speaking with you. Can we get the first poll question loaded? So I wanted to start off just to see who I'm speaking to today, professionals or parents, and then whether, if you're a parent, if your child has an IEP. So while that poll question is loading, I just wanted to give a little bit more background about myself. So I've been working with Tim Hartshorn in the Charge Syndrome Research Lab at Central Michigan University since 2016. And I've had a lot of great opportunities to work directly with charge families and professionals in that time. So, and that all of that work has kind of culminated to this educational checklist.
The bottom one is the, there you go.
There is the larger one in the middle.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize it was in there. Awesome. So it looks like we have mostly parents here today and a couple professionals. So that is helpful for me to be able to know how to kind of guide this presentation. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'll start with a rationale for the checklist. So why did we go about developing this? Then I'll talk about how we went about developing the checklist. I'll talk about the checklist itself, give you an overview of what is contained in the checklist, then how you can use the checklist as either a parent or a professional. And then there will be some time for questions as well. And I really encourage you to send questions throughout the presentation. I want to make sure that this presentation is meeting your needs. So any question that you have, I'm happy to answer. And I also want to make it known that I see the checklist as a constantly evolving tool. So I always welcome feedback from parents and professionals. So if at any point, either during the presentation or after, you want to reach out to me to let me know ways that you think the checklist can be improved, I absolutely welcome that. I've made several changes to the checklist based on feedback after presentations like this, and I think that helps us just make the tool the best that it can be for this population. So starting with the rationale, we know that charge syndrome is extremely low incidence, so occurring in approximately 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 15,000 births. So a lot of times when a student with charge starts at school, that's the first time that school team has ever educated a student with charge. And on top of that, charge is so complex. So there's so many medical, behavioral, developmental, and communicative and sensory challenges with students with charge. So even if the school has happened to have another student with charge before, the presentation of symptoms and characteristics of charge is likely going to be very different. So meeting the needs of each individual student with charge can be really, really difficult. And because of this, educators likely don't fully understand charge unless your child is going to a school that has really specialized in deafblindness or in low incidence syndromes like charge. And when I was just starting out my research in charge, something that I heard time and time again from parents is that they are constantly advocating for their child to the schools, and the educators aren't always listening to them, or the school team is trying to fit their children into these specific boxes that their child just doesn't fit because they have all of these really unique and really specialized needs. And this is really unfortunate because as parents, as every parent, but especially parents of kids with charge, you are their number one advocate. You are there with them through every different setting, all of the medical procedures, all of the therapies that they're receiving, and you are really the lead team member. So it's really unfortunate when educators don't respect your expertise and really defer to you as an equal team member. So coming into grad school, I knew that I wanted to do something to try to increase awareness about charge syndrome and help parents feel like they were being heard and that their child's needs were being met at school. And I was really lucky to attend the Charge Syndrome Conference in Orlando, Florida in 2017, right before starting in my graduate program. And I heard the presentation on the Charge Syndrome Checklist, Health Supervision Across the Lifespan, which is developed by Trider, Dr. Blake, and colleagues. And this is a phenomenal tool. And I have a picture of it on this next slide. Essentially, this is a tool for medical providers. It provides an overview of a lot of the really common medical charge characteristics, and it provides some guidance for when providers should be checking for those specific concerns throughout the life. And when I heard about this, I thought, oh my gosh, this is just perfect. We need to do something like this for the schools, because with my training in school psychology, a lot of the educators that I've worked with, they all want to do the best for their students, but we know that educators are extremely busy and there's a lot of time constraints. So I thought it would be great for me and my lab to kind of compile all of the recommendations into a really usable tool for school professionals. So how we develop the checklist. I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I will be brief for the purpose of this presentation. I just want to really highlight all of the professionals and family members that were really pivotal in the development of this tool. So first, the Charge Syndrome Research Lab at Central Michigan University, which is led by Tim Hartshorn and consists of graduate school psychology students and undergraduate students. They were extremely helpful in developing this. I did a pretty extensive literature review on all of the professional recommendations for that professionals have made for students with charge, and then I kind of brought it to my research lab, and we started putting together a really, really rough draft of what we wanted this to look like. And then I was extremely lucky to work with an international panel of experts in charge and deafblindness, and again, I could talk at length about how amazing each of these panel members is and all of their credentials. But for the sake of time, I'll just tell you who was a part of it. So there's David Brown, Beth Kennedy, Rob Last, Jude Nicholas, Nancy Salem Hartshorn, and Casey Stratton. And they devoted a ton of time to helping me develop this. They rated every single aspect of the checklist at every stage of development and provided consistent feedback about anything to add, change, or remove about the checklist. And this is a really interdisciplinary team. So we've got people who are really experienced with the deafblind projects. We have professionals who were teachers. We have school psychologists. We've got a parent of someone with charge. So we really had a pretty well-rounded team here working on this. And then after we had a pretty good draft of the checklist, we sent it out to a select group of parents of individuals with charge, professionals, and educational professionals and state deafblind project employees. So at every stage of development, we really tried to include parents and professionals who are really experienced in the world of charge and really knew how to work with these students. So moving into the checklist itself, this will make up the bulk of the presentation. The checklist is a 14-page document which consists of 4 main sections. The first is an introductory page, and this provides an overview of charge syndrome. So what are the common characteristics? What are the diagnostic criteria? It also provides an overview of the checklist and how professionals can use it. And it also provides an overview of what I call the 5 educationally relevant domains of charge syndrome, which I'm going to go more into that in the next couple of slides. And then the actual physical checklist itself is made up of 5 different categories or columns, and then 27 rows or characteristics and concerns that are common to students with charge, which are broken up into those 5 educationally relevant domains. And I'll be providing some pictures of the checklist because I know that's kind of abstract to be able to try to figure out what that actually means. And then we have a glossary to try to make it as readable and accessible as possible to everyone using it. So the glossary outlines some of those more jargony charge terminology that educational professionals might not be aware of, such as coinaltresia or coloboma. Those are words that most educational professionals probably have never heard before. And it also outlines some of the more school jargon, more jargony terms that parents, especially when you're just starting out in the school systems, you might not really be familiar with. So the purpose of that is to try to make the tool as accessible as possible to both parents and professionals. And then we have a selected reference list. And there was a lot of literature that went into the development of this checklist. But for the purpose of the tool, we wanted to just highlight some of the most key references that we used and kind of highlight what were the most important resources that professionals should look over if they have the time. So when I was putting together the checklist and starting to conceptualize what is the educational impact of having charge, I started to kind of group it into categories. And we ended up with these 5 categories being medical, sensory, communication, developmental, and behavioral. And so parents, while you likely know the impact of charge on your child's ability to learn, I find it kind of helpful to group it into these domains. So you kind of have a reference when you're looking at the services that your child is receiving and to see, okay, are there some areas that really are not being addressed at school? And if so, how can we work to make sure that those are being addressed in the school system? So starting off with the medical domain. We know that individuals with charge are extremely medically complex and fragile, especially during the first several years of their lives. So the priority for the first several years is really medical management and trying to keep these children alive. So they're in and out of the hospital, receiving numerous surgeries and procedures. And that really impacts their ability to be present for those early intervention services. You can't have early intervention before the child is medically stable. We need to keep the kids alive first before we can start focusing on the more educational pieces. And this is really important for school teams to understand the medical history of the child because it plays a huge role in their ability to learn currently. It's really important because school teams are likely going to be involved in medical management at school. So they really need to know what is the history of the medical concerns with this child and what role do they play in maintaining medical management at school. And although a lot of the hospitalizations are more concentrated in the first few years of life, individuals with charge have surgeries and procedures throughout their life, and they're often going to be missing a lot of school because of this. So it's important for the school team to really understand that and helping provide as much support as they can while understanding the really complex medical concerns of these students. And then moving into the sensory domain. This is a huge one for kids with charge. We know that individuals with charge have multiple sensory loss. Every single sense can be impacted. So we have vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch, proprioception, and vestibular. And some of those senses are likely going to have more of an impact on education than others, but all of them are really important. If you think of even taste, you might not think that might be have a huge educational impact, but it still does because especially in the younger years, there might be some school assignments where you're tasting cookies that you baked in class, or you are learning to smell different scents. And if the individual in charge can't access those things, then they're missing out on those learning opportunities. So even the senses that seem like they might not be as impactful, when taken in combination with all the other senses, they are extremely impactful. So sensory loss is so important for school teams to address because schools and the world in general is really not designed for people with sensory loss. All of the information that is typically presented is presented in a way that is mostly accessible to people who have fully functioning vision and hearing. And it's the educational team's job to provide access and to make sure that these students are able to access the curriculum and access the educational environment. So it's really important to try to maximize sensory input in order to increase accessibility. And then the next domain is communication. And there are a lot of communication barriers for students with charge, both expressively and receptively. So by expressively, I mean the child's ability to communicate outwardly to others, and receptive, I mean their ability to understand others' communication. And these communication barriers come from, there's multiple reasons for those. The first is sensory loss. So especially with vision and hearing loss, these individuals are missing out on a lot of environmental cues. So they're not picking up on other people's attempts to communicate with them, and they might not be able to communicate in a way that people outside of their immediate bubble are able to understand. And beyond the sensory loss, there's also structural anomalies. So we've got the cleft lip and palate and corneal atresia, and this can make it really difficult for individuals with charge to be able to communicate in a way that's clearly understandable to others. So while the parents, you probably do a great job understanding your child, and you can really understand the minor differences in the way that they're speaking. But for professionals who are new to your child or just meeting them for the first time, it can be really hard for these children to communicate effectively. And the common recommendation to addressing communication barriers is utilizing a total communication system. And what that means is utilizing as many different communicative methods as possible to maximize communication for students with charge. So that's using a combination of spoken language, sign language, picture cues, tactile objects, as many different ways as you can think of, and testing them out in combination to see what works best for the specific student. And it's really important to meet the child where they're at, so they have some way of communicating. A lot of times, students with charge start off communicating in a more with gestures and more with their behaviors. And by the time they reach adulthood, there's a really wide range of outcomes for how individuals with charge communicate, ranging from fluent spoken language, fluent sign, to still relying more on the picture cues and more augmented communication. But it's important if the child is communicating more behaviorally or gesturally, really being attentive to that and kind of being like a communication detective and trying to figure out what is this child communicating by their really minor behavior changes, and how can we build on that to help them learn some more ways that are more understandable to a wider audience. And then the developmental domain. So individuals with charge typically have global developmental delays, and by that I mean delays in cognitive development, physical development, and social emotional development, on top of the delays in communication development as well. And there are, again, multiple reasons for this. A big one is the medical complexity and the time spent in and out of the hospital early in life, where you're missing out on those really key periods for developing those skills. So if a child is spending the first year of their life in the hospital, they are not getting the typical experiences of a typically developing child. So they're missing out on those learning opportunities. Additionally, multiple sensory loss is very impactful for development, especially if we're not providing access to different learning opportunities early in life. It can be it can almost be like the child is very cut off from the outside world if we're not doing if we're not taking additional strategies to try to combat that. And then again, the structural anomalies such as low muscle tone and the cleft lip and palate can really impact a lot of different areas of development. So what's important to know about these developmental delays and these global delays early in life is that we should never, ever write off these kids. The potential for individuals with charge is just amazing if they are given access to the environment, and if they receive early intervention, and if we're we as professionals are doing our job to help them succeed, then they will. That we can see a lot of growth in these individuals, and we should never, based on how they are presenting early in life, we should never write them off and assume that they're not going to be able to achieve amazing things. Actually, I was really excited to, when I first started recruiting participants for my dissertation, I had an adult with Charge syndrome reach out to me who is now in college, and she said she wanted to talk to me about her educational experiences. And something that she mentioned is that during her life, her teachers underestimated her, and she would try to be reading books, and they would take it away from her and say like, "Oh no, you can't read." And she could read, and she's in college now. And I think we should always assume competence for these individuals, and we should always be pushing them to achieve their best, and we should always be working to remove barriers for them, because that's really what they need from us. And then finally, the domain of behavior. And a lot of individuals with Charge exhibit some pretty challenging behaviors, and it can be really hard for parents and professionals to be able to not only understand the behavior, but also know how to address it in a way that is going to be ultimately beneficial for the child. So Tim Hartshorn, my advisor, has done a lot of work in this area, so this slide is pretty much devoted to him. He came up with a Charge behavioral phenotype, which I wanted to highlight. So the first is low normal cognitive functioning. And with all of these, I want to note that there is a really wide range. So while the average might be low normal cognitive functioning, there is a complete spread from below average to above average, just as there would be in any population. And I think we always want to be careful with when we are how we're describing the cognitive abilities of students with Charge, because we know that we don't have very good measures for getting a good measure of intelligence as it's typically known. So we always want to be saying that with a lot of caution. And we know that individuals with Charge can achieve really great things. The second is being socially interested but immature. If you've been to a Charge conference, or if you're a parent of someone with Charge, you know that a lot of these kids are so interested in making friends, establishing social connections, and really expanding their social world. But because of some of the characteristics of Charge, they miss out on a lot of the learning opportunities to sometimes be able to do that appropriately. So while they have the desire, they might not always go about it in the most age-appropriate way. Next is repetitive behaviors, which increase under stress. And for this one, it's very common for individuals with Charge to do a lot of checking behaviors. So always checking to make sure their shoes are where they left them, or their water bottles where they left them. And we see that increasing under stress because it's a lot easier for people with typically developing senses to just quickly check to see, oh, is my phone right there? Yep, it is. And no one notices that I'm doing that. But with individuals with Charge, because of their sensory loss, it's very obvious when they're engaging in these repetitive behaviors. So I think sometimes it gets noticed a little bit more in them, because if they want to check if their shoes are where they left them, they have to walk across the room, kneel down, feel to see if their shoes are there, and then they know. Whereas I would be able to just look over and say, oh, yep, my shoes are there. So I think that we probably don't realize how often we actually engage in these very similar repetitive behaviors when we're under stress. Next is a high degree of sensation seeking. If you're on the Charge Syndrome Facebook pages, you've probably seen a lot of the really unique ways that kids with Charge seek sensations. Some of my favorite ways that I've seen are kids laying upside down to kind of stimulate or stabilize their vestibular sense, doing the charge sit where they I can't really demonstrate it right now, but basically putting their foot on their leg and making like a 4-point sitting posture to really stabilize their body. There's or maybe it's as simple as just like licking things. Basically, any way that they can get sensory input, kids with charge are often going to be doing this. The next is the tendency to lose behavioral control and self-regulation when stressed or sensory overloaded. And with all of the different, with everything going on with charge, it can be really, really hard to regulate your emotions. So basically all day they are trying to stay focused on tasks at hand and try to stabilize their senses, and that takes a lot of energy. So it might be a little bit easier for them to be deregulated because they are always trying to focus on keeping themselves in check. So we do tend to see what seems like to us maybe is a very minor trigger that can really blow up for an individual with charge, because they're trying all day just to keep it together. And so one little drop in a cup might seem like a drop to us, but that's just enough to make it overflow. And the next is, the final one is difficulty shifting attention. So it can be really hard. A lot of times individuals with charge have to put a lot of focus into what they are working on in the moment. So it's not as easy for them to just say okay, now I'm focusing on something else, because it does take more effort to be able to really devote their attention to something than it would with someone with typical senses. I also just wanted to highlight the behavior triangle, which provides some additional considerations for behavior. And I won't go too much into that because we will be talking about this in the behavior panel next. But always with behavior, it's important to consider pain, anxiety, and sensory issues. And that's all I'll say for now, because we're going to be talking at length about that in our next presentation. And finally, for the behavioral domain, it's just so important to consider behavior as a form of communication. A lot of times, this is where individuals with charge begin for their ability to communicate. So we really need to be paying attention to these little cues that they're giving us and try to figure out what are they trying to tell us, and never trying to take away that form of communication or reduce that behavior without giving them another way to communicate the same thing, because individuals with charge already have limited ways of communicating with the outside world. So the last thing that we want to do is take that away. So those are the domains that the checklist is broken into. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of give you an outline of what the checklist actually looks like. So this is the first page of the checklist. It's the medical domain. So as you can see, there are several characteristics and concerns that are more medical in nature. So I wanted to go over what the different columns and point you to some key considerations for each. So the first is the characteristics and concerns column. And there's 27 different characteristics and concerns that are grouped into those 5 domains that I just went over. And those are really the most common educationally relevant concerns that students with charge typically present with. So right after that, we have a little check and a small column there. And the point of that is to really highlight the uniqueness of individuals with charge. So parents or professionals can go through and check off which characteristic the specific child or student has. So you can kind of narrow down the checklist to see, okay, what specific considerations should we be making for this specific student? Because of course, individuals with charge are so different that we can't possibly say, okay, every single strategy here is going to work for every single student with charge. That's just not realistic. So the point of that is to really narrow it down to be individualized to your child or student. The next column is educational or support needs. And these are the needs that result from those specific characteristics and concerns. And that's kind of twofold. That can be either what the child needs as a result of that characteristic, or what the school needs to do to be able to meet the needs of the specific student. And next we have team members. And I want to highlight there that we made a note saying that parents, special and general educators, and interveners should be consulted in most areas. That's because they could be listed in every single one of these areas. So, and we really wanted to make it clear, especially parents, that you are a team member and you are one of the most valuable team members. And you have such an expertise in your child, and I hope that can be really conveyed to them, because you're the one that manages their entire life. So my goal with this checklist is to highlight that you are a team member, and that you should be consulted at every step in every domain. I also want to highlight interveners, and I know that I want to define interveners because there's a lot of variability from state to state on whether interveners are provided or even an option. So interveners are specially trained paraprofessionals who receive training in deafblindness, and the purpose of them is to provide access to students who are deafblind to help them really access the educational environment. And unfortunately, interveners are not mandated for students who are deafblind. Hopefully at some point they will be, because they are just such an important professional to have on the team. Next, we have examples of strategies and accommodations, and with a note there that the team should really discuss and modify to fit the individual needs. So again, it's really not possible to make a one-size-fits-all accommodation list for students with charge, because every child is so different. But what we did is we took some of the really common professional recommendations, and we put it there as a starting point, just to get the ball rolling and provide some guidance for how to support these students at school. And then finally, we have consulting professionals. So these are professionals outside of the school team who are not going to be involved in the day-to-day service delivery at school, but are likely going to be helpful to consult with, just to make sure that there is kind of cohesive services across settings. And the note here says that state deafblind projects should be consulted in most areas. And I just want to take a moment to highlight the state deafblind projects. They are such a phenomenal resource for parents and for school teams, and I highly recommend, if your child is not registered with the State Deafblind Project, to do so immediately. They can provide really valuable trainings to schools, and they can just be an extra voice at your IEP meetings. I've had the opportunity to work really closely with Deafblind Central, which is the State Deafblind Project in Michigan, and so I'm pretty familiar with the types of work that the State Deafblind Projects can do, and I cannot highlight enough how important they are and how helpful they can be to kind of amplifying your voice, parents, and also helping educate the school professionals on the unique needs of students who are deafblind. So I think we're gonna, if I could have the poll question loaded up. So I'm gonna start going into some examples of really common characteristics, just to walk you through some examples from the checklist. So I want to start off by asking, does your child have some degree of vision loss? And all right, so about 73% said yes, and 27% said no. And that's pretty close to what we see in general research. Typically, we see between like 80 and 90% of individuals with charge have some degree of vision loss. So starting off with this category in the sensory domain, ocular defects. So this contains most commonly colobomas of the eye, which are a portion of the eye that's not completely formed, which leads to some degree of visual field loss. So that is the characteristic and concern, and the educational or support needs that result from that are having access to the visual environment. It's important that school team members understand functional vision, the risk for retinal detachment. They understand what kind of equipment that the child is using and what that does for the student and what it doesn't do for the student. Also understanding light sensitivity and the visual field. So kind of to summarize that educational support need, it's really important for the school professionals to understand the functional vision of the student with charge and how they use it and how they can best support them to access the visual environment at school. And team members that are likely going to be involved here are a teacher consultant for the visually impaired and certified orientation and mobility specialists. So those two professionals can provide a lot of support in navigating the environment and helping school professionals adjust their typical methods to be able to meet the needs of a student with vision loss. And some examples of strategies and accommodations are, of course, a functional vision assessment. It's really important to know how the student is using their vision. So where are their visual field loss? What's their visual acuity? Where should information be provided to them? It's also important to do a learning media assessment. So trying to see what kind of equipment is the child using, and how can the school team make sure that the child is using those effectively at school. And then also providing a wide range of environmental accommodations, so such as large print, braille, angled work surfaces, and then also making sure that they are wearing their glasses, and also establishing a communication bubble, so making sure that everyone knows where the student best accesses communication, and how they can facilitate that. And then some consulting professionals might be an ophthalmologist, optometrist, low vision specialists, and then the state deafblind projects.
Do you want a question in the middle?
Yeah.
Oh, so one of the questions we had is, what can I tell my education team of how to use an intervener or deafblind consultant? So what would a family kind of member be able to indicate to the school? Because particularly you're kind of talking about interveners, deafblind projects at this point. I thought it might be a good time to answer that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a great way of doing that is consult with your deafblind project and ask if they would be willing to do a training on charge syndrome to the school team. I know that in Michigan, those our director does those pretty frequently. So you can kind of just bring them in as a consultant, and the deafblind project can also help you facilitate that. So they can reach out to the school team and say, hey, we want to do this training, or hey, here's some resources. The deafblind projects will be able to help you facilitate that, but it is totally within your rights as a parent to say, hey, I want to bring this other person in. It's kind of similar to bringing in like an educational advocate. You have the ability to do that, and kind of just set a standard that the deafblind projects are going to be a team member, and they're going to be invited to the IEP, and then they just get put on the invite list, and they can join the IEPs and kind of be a team member just like anyone else would.
And I think they're really uniquely positioned too, to the deafblind projects especially, to understand the sensory loss, and they work with a lot of kids with charge. So I think that's another great way to.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. Okay.
All right. If we can load up the next poll question, does your child have some degree of hearing loss?
We'll come back to that and keep going then.
Could I get my slide back on the screen, please? Thank you. Okay, so auditory issues and ear abnormalities. We know that hearing loss is almost universal or hearing loss and some degree of ear abnormalities are pretty much universal in charge. So the educational or support need that comes from that is similar to vision loss, is having access to the auditory environment. It's important for the school team to understand the degree and type of hearing loss, as well as any equipment that the child uses to manage. And team members here are likely going to include a teacher consultant for the hearing impaired, who, similar for the teacher consultant for the visually impaired, can provide some really helpful strategies for making sure that the student can access the auditory environment at school. And some strategies here include having regular functional hearing assessments to determine how is the child using their hearing, has their hearing changed over time, making sure that the child is using assistive technology, and making sure that it's being consistently used across the day. So such as like an FM system. I've heard from some adults or older adolescents with charge that, especially when they got to middle or high school, that their teachers didn't have the FM system up and running, or they had to go out of their way to ask them to wear the to have that set up, which led to them just not getting materials and that, or not getting full access to the to sound in that class. Also being understanding of medical interventions. Of course, the school teams are not going to be involved in getting the medical interventions up and running, but they should be knowledgeable about how to manage those at school. And then also minimizing auditory distractions, so to make sure that they can focus on what they need to be hearing, and also promoting sign language if it's appropriate for that specific student.
And I think our poll is up for the hearing question,
Okay.
so we should be able to refer to it soon.
Great. And then with consulting professionals, likely going to be consulting with an audiologist, an ENT, and the state deafblind projects. All right, so the poll
Wow.
says 100% of participants, their child has some degree of hearing loss. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that. That's exactly what I would be expecting. This is one of the most characteristic features of charge. All right. And so I think we already had the poll for, is your child considered deafblind? So if I can get the results of that up on my screen, please.
If I remember, that was about 73%.
73%?
Or
Okay.
70.
Great.
Okay.
So about 70% are of children are considered deafblind, and for people who are attending right now. And that's about what we've seen in research too. Sometimes you might not consider your child deafblind, but deafblindness really means any degree of vision and hearing loss. So it's likely that the majority of individuals with charge are deafblind. If I can get my slide back up, thank you. Then is your child registered with your state deafblind project?
If you're not sure what a state deafblind project is, probably the answer is no.
Yes. So the state deafblind projects, if you're not familiar, are they're federally funded technical assistance centers that provide consultative services to students with charge from birth to 21.
Okay, so hopefully we'll have a poll.
Awesome. 88% are registered with the state deafblind projects. I'm really happy to hear that, and I highly recommend consulting with them. They are extremely helpful and in providing resources, and also like getting some family connections in your area. All right, so we've talked about vision loss and hearing loss separately, but deafblindness is different than just talking about both of those in isolation. Deafblindness is really unique, and there are additional considerations on top of just addressing hearing loss and vision loss in isolation. So for educational and support needs, it's really important to provide access to the environment. When you have both vision and hearing loss, it's really hard to access what is happening in your surroundings. And it's important for school teams to understand the complexity of combined vision and hearing loss, and also have knowledge of deafblind specific interventions, because a lot of times with either vision loss or hearing loss in isolation, some of those strategies involve relying more heavily on your other senses. But if you have multiple sensory loss, it's more difficult to rely on your residual senses to be able to supplement the information missing from one specific sense. So team members here could be a teacher of the deafblind and definitely an intervener. Those can be really helpful for providing access to the environment. And some examples of strategies and accommodations here are to simultaneously address the impact of vision and hearing loss, and making information available through multiple sensory channels, so using a total communication approach. And then finally, direct instruction. So a lot of typical learning styles for people with typically developing senses is there's a lot of learning that happens incidentally, meaning that you learn through observing others and kind of just observing your environment. With individuals who are deafblind, you need to be much more explicit in the way that you teach things, because they're missing out on a lot of that information that they would be able to just pick up on if they had fully functioning senses. And consulting professionals here are definitely going to include the state deafblind projects, and then likely an ophthalmologist and an audiologist as well.
We had a question about how to get your child registered with a state deafblind project.
Great question. So if you go to National Center on Deafblindness and you search state deafblind projects, they will have a list. You can search by state to find your specific state. And if you go to your state's website, pretty much like right there on the front and center. Typically, register your child here. So if you look up those resources, you should be able to find that. And I think can we make that available for
Yeah,
them?
we can try to get that on a resource list afterwards. And I guess I'd also just reassure people that many of the programs really do understand charge. And even if your child doesn't have vision impairment, you might reach out to them and see whether or not their services could be helpful. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, so our next poll is, does your child have balance difficulties? All right, and again, 100% says yes. I'm not surprised by this. Balance difficulties are pretty universal in kids with charge. So this is telling me that I picked the right characteristics to highlight for today, because everyone is we're having almost 100% on each of these. All right. So for vestibular system impairments, if you were on the presentation right before this, you just heard a lot about this. And if you weren't able to attend that, I would highly recommend watching the recording, because they're going to go much more in depth than I'm able to right now. Basically, vestibular system impairment affects balance. And this actually has a huge educational implication that you might not think. But some educational or support needs are providing balance, or just being able to balance throughout the day, providing opportunity for independence of mobility, and then understanding the need for unconventional positions. So it is extremely common for kids with charge to be more available to learn if they're laying horizontally or laying upside down. A lot of times school teams don't like this, and they think that means that the child is not paying attention. But in reality, that's the position that the child has discovered that is most beneficial for them to be able to access the environment. Another big one is kids with charge often put their hand on their head like this to be able to stabilize their view. And that, in combination with their visual field loss, it could look like they might be looking like this, so looking kind of up. And that might look like the child is daydreaming, but in reality, they are stabilizing their head and putting moving their eyes so that their visual field is capturing the educational material. So it's just really important for school teams to understand the need for these different positions. And some other examples of strategies and accommodations are going to be providing the vestibular system stimulation, providing opportunity for movement, and giving them seats that allow them to be the most stable. So having seats with arms or seats with footrests, so that they don't have to be spending energy trying to stabilize their body themselves. All right, so in our last couple minutes here, I just wanted to talk about how you can use the checklist. So for parents, you can provide this to your school team, and I would recommend doing that as soon as you can before a reevaluation. If it's an initial evaluation, I think this is a great tool to give them to get them up to speed on charge syndrome. From the experience that I've had presenting this to professionals, they're typically pretty excited to have this, because they want to know more about your child. They want to work with you. It's just educators don't have enough time, unfortunately, to do the heavy lifting research to learn everything that there is to know about charge. I've been researching charge for over 4 years now, and it's still a lot. Like, I still learn so much every day. So I think that providing this to the school team can really help communicate that you are a valuable team member, you have a lot of information to provide, and that you're going to be working together. If your child already has an IEP, you can still provide this to the team, and you can request additional assessments or additional accommodations be provided to your child based on the checklist. Another thing that you could do is you can make an about your child PowerPoint for your school team. You could use the checklist to kind of format, like, okay, here's how they're impacted medically, here's how they're impacted behaviorally. And that, in combination with a checklist, can kind of help school teams really understand your child's unique needs. You can also use this to learn about possible accommodations for your child. So especially parents who are just starting out in the educational systems, it's not possible for you to know everything that's out there. Although I have no doubt that you will within just a very short period of time, because you're very resourceful and there's such a good community in the charge on the church Facebook page where you can be asking these questions to other parents and try to navigate it. So yeah, you can learn about what's out there for your child and what might you want to ask for your child's IEP. And you can use this when advocating for your child. We've tried to make this checklist very reflective of what parents are asking for. So hopefully this tool can be used to amplify your voice and say, like, listen, I'm not just asking for this. This is what professionals recommend. And unfortunately, sometimes professionals listen more to other professionals. But the good thing is that we've listened to you when making this. So this is hopefully reflective of what you would want for your child. And if it's not, let me know and I can add it in, because I think that is extremely important. So some next steps, I'm currently collecting data on my dissertation, which kind of extends my research on the educational checklist. So I'm currently looking into educational experiences of students with charge. We're kind of seeing, like, based on what we recommended in the checklist, what are kids actually receiving at school and where are the discrepancies? Like, what are the main things that we recommended in the checklist that are not being done in the schools? And is there anything that the schools are doing that we didn't include? If so, let's change the checklist to make sure that we're including it. So I'm currently collecting data, and we need participants. So if anyone is interested in participating, please shoot me an email. You can also check on the Charge Facebook page. I've been posting about it in there. It would really help me to be able to know how to better improve the checklist and better understand the educational outcomes of kids with charge. We know that kids with charge do great things, and it'd be really great for us to know, to be able to, like, concretely say, like, this is the range of the amazing things that kids with charge are able to achieve at school.
So we're getting a lot of good feedback. People are thinking it's a very helpful tool and wondering where might they find your checklist.
Well, I'm glad you asked.
Is that your next one? All right.
I don't know if it's on my slide, but we do. I think that we can send it out, and it's also, if you look on the National Center on Deaf Blindness, it is it's posted as a resource there. So yeah, we can definitely make sure that everyone.
Yeah, just to file back to interveners, there's a lot of good stuff on interveners on the National Center for Deafblind. Yes. That's a great website. I agree.
Yes,
awesome.
There's so many amazing resources there. There's also, just to note from that, there is a training module on that it's a training module for deafblind interveners. So even if your school doesn't have a specific deafblind intervener, you can provide that training to school professionals so they can go through it and learn a lot about charge. Mm-hmm. So that's called the Open Hands, Open Access training module on deafblindness, and you can find that through the National Center on Deafblindness.
Yeah, it's a lot of hours of training, but it's a really good one. And so if your school's really motivated to do a better job, sometimes paraprofessionals will take it and get a certification and some educational units. So it's a really good resource. Yeah.
So I don't know if we have time for
maybe about 10 minutes. So we're good.
Okay, awesome.
9-10 minutes. Yeah.
Great. So if we, I would love to hear in the chat if parents have either any questions or if what your experience has been like with the school teams, positive or negative. I like to hear both. Some parents have asked me for my dissertation, do you want us to participate if we're happy with our kids' IEPs? Yeah. Yes. I want to know what makes you happy, and so we can help out the people who are not as happy. So yeah, I'd love to hear in the chat your experiences with your school teams, if you're satisfied with your child's IEPs, and what you wish professionals understood about your child.
Yeah, I know. I mean, because we are not here with you, I'm kind of missing out on the opportunity to learn from each other. So I'm hoping everybody's using that chat to help us, connect in a very different virtual sort of way. So there tends to be maybe a little lag, so I will not sing and dance. That would be really bad. All right. With your experience, do you consider parents would do better work educating our children with the support of all the professionals? And that would be in the instance where parents who can dedicate more time to educating our children. And probably, I don't know if this is the context either, but I know with COVID and schools doing a lot of remote instruction and even trying to sort through what's safe and not safe, I guess for those who want to pursue homeschooling or those sorts of options with school support, whether you've seen folks who've done this, what's been working, just trying to kind of expand out that question.
Yeah, I think that is definitely an avenue that I've seen parents go through, be it if they feel like the school team is not adequately meeting their child's needs, and they feel like they can do it in a better and more safe way at home. I've definitely seen parents do that. I think that can certainly be beneficial. As long as you're still consulting with the school team, because that's a lot of hats for you to wear as a parent. And I have no doubt in your ability to do so, because charge parents are just phenomenal, and you learn so much about how to care for your child and how to meet your child's needs. But I think as long as you're having really good communication with the school team, and if you can do a combination of, I know right now some families are getting, they're doing like telehealth services, so you can virtually meet with the school team, and they can observe you implementing specific interventions with the child, and collaborate from there. And I think something that I would note is I think homeschool can be a really great option for kids, but I think it's also important to make sure that they're having the opportunity to learn among their peers. There's a lot that peers can teach each other that we can't as adults. So I think there are some really good learning opportunities there. But as always, it's going to depend on your unique situation.
Yeah, and I think every kid's different and every family's different, and so sometimes that works out really well. I've been seeing a lot of kids lately, and just each family's making different choices that works for them. So also just be empowered to be okay that what you're choosing, whether it's similar to somebody else or different, you know your child best, and also know your resources. And I thought one other resource that I often give folks is, and this is not an easy one for everyone to access, but Perkins has a really great program that will sometimes do consultations, or I've had some families seek them out for a week-long program that really gets to know their child and give educational suggestions back to the team. I do think there's funding issues with that. There's travel issues. Of course, now with COVID, it's tricky. I think I've had some school districts who've been willing to support that type of guidance, so you get that checklist on steroids with as an approach. Awesome. We have about 4 more minutes. I don't have any questions in the chat at this moment. I think we could also, what we are going to do next for those who, if we're kind of just waiting, is we're going to have a break until about 10:15. So I'm going to give a little bit more time for any questions. But we'll have a break so you can I don't know, get a second cup of coffee. I think if I were at home, I'd have probably went, well, maybe this is my time I can shower, but I had to do it earlier. So living in this virtual world, oh, here we go, great. Let's see, do most IEPs you reviewed have an area discussing testing accommodations, particularly in that presented with total communication, extra time to complete? I mean, I think too, I'm going to add a little bit to that, knowing that a lot of kids need processing time and we don't often give them that. So I've heard from families saying, hey, I videotaped what it takes in a processing time to show my team, but alternative and accommodations for testing is the question.
Yeah, so I will say I'm in the very preliminary stages of analyzing the IEPs, but that is something that I've seen in pretty much every IEP that I've looked through. There is typically extended testing time. I don't know, I haven't looked in depth enough to see about like a total communication approach to testing, but there's definitely a huge section in pretty much every IEP that I've looked at so far that details the accommodations for extended testing time, especially.
And, honestly, there are no great tools. You talked about that earlier. So it's really hard to get meaningful information, and standardized tests aren't always the approach. So I think those are great questions. I know folks that I've worked with have sometimes leveraged their schools for the state schools for the visually impaired or state schools for the deaf, who can maybe do a better job of getting a communication understanding depending on the modality. I think maybe, here we go. Will this recording be available for me to share with coworkers? Yes, we do. We're going to archive all this, and I was sitting here taking notes of like what we need to add in, and recognized, even spreading this information out through the deaf-blind projects would be a great dissemination strategy too. So just as our other conferences, we will have this online and archived. And I
Right.
think as a family member, you're probably going to want to get to that toolkit on the National Center for Deafblind. That
And
sounds like an infomercial.
I know. I am always happy to. I love getting emails from parents and professionals. If you have something that you want to pick my brain about, please email me. That helps me grow so much as a professional. And if I could spend all of my time just consulting with school teams on how to better support kids with charge, I would. So please shoot me an email. I would love to chat with you or just to hear your experiences. That it helps me know more about charge. So please do that.
Yeah, awesome. So we're getting close to that 10 o'clock moment. One other resource that I have become more aware of is I've always known about Hands and Voices, which is a national agency of parents supporting kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. They have a Deaf Plus subgroup, so kind of deaf and hard of hearing plus, and a lot of folks are kind of connecting that with Facebook. And I think there's difficulty finding the best classroom placement and the best way to navigate that. We have probably 30 seconds left. Can you do a soundbite on that?
It's really hard to figure out the right placement. And I think it's okay if there's some trial and error. Your kids are really unique and their needs are very complex. So it is totally okay if you don't get it right on the first try. Of course, we want to as parents, you do, but it's gonna take some learning. So the best that you can do is try as many strategies as you can and see what sticks and what works for your child. And it's okay if it's not perfect at first, because hopefully you can get there.
Yeah, and I've totally seen that shift over time. So what might work at one moment of a child's development isn't working for a later moment. And so the flexibility to move across settings can sometimes really make a difference. So awesome. Well, we are at the 10 o'clock hour. We're going to take a short break, 15 minutes. You're going to get just a screen of not a whole lot, but please come back in about 15 minutes. Lily will still be here, and we're going to add 2 more amazing people to talk about behavior. Thanks.
Awesome.